Smithsonian Associates Interview Series on radio and podcast. The show covering all things health, wellness, culture, and more. The show for all of us who aren't old, we're better. Each week, we'll interview superstars, experts, and ordinary people doing extraordinary things, all related to this wonderful experience of getting better, not just older. Now, here's your host, the award-winning Paul Vogelzang.
Welcome to the Not Old Better Show Smithsonian Associates Interview Series on radio and podcast. I'm Paul Vogelzang, and today we dive into a narrative that only revolutionizes our understanding of an iconic rock band, but challenges conventional thought about who deserves a piece and a place in the annals of history. Joining us today is Smithsonian Associate and previous guest here on the program, Beatles historian, author Kenneth Womack. Ken Womack will be appearing at Smithsonian Associates coming up, so please check out our website for more details about Ken Womack's presentation titled Living the Beatles Legend, the Untold Story of Mal Evans. We have a lot to unpack today, so let's get into it. What you're about to hear challenges the way we view history, music, and the people who stand just outside the limelight. In advance of Ken Womack's presentation at Smithsonian Associates, our conversation today takes an unexpected turn as Ken Womack delves into his latest work, a biography about Mal Evans. Womack's book, Living the Beatles Legend, the Untold Story of Mal Evans, is the story of the Beatles' longtime personal assistant. For those of you unfamiliar with Mal Evans, you're not alone. His story is largely untold, and much of what's been written about him has turned out to be incorrect. This book by Ken Womack, backed by exhaustive research that only Ken Womack can do, seeks to set the record straight. The Evans that emerges from Womack's work is a far cry from the hulking background figure that history has often painted. Mal Evans, the Beatles' longtime roadie, personal assistant, and devoted friend, was an invaluable member of the band's inner circle. A towering figure in horn-rimmed glasses, Mal Evans loomed large in the Beatles' story, contributing at times as a performer and sometimes lyricist, while struggling to protect his beloved boys. Mal Evans was there for the whole of the group's remarkable story, from the Shea Stadium triumph through the creation of the timeless cover art for Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and the famous Let It Be rooftop concert.
As March rolled on, the boys began to make quick work of the Sgt. Pepper LP. A deadline of sorts had materialized for the album's completion. On April 3rd, Paul planned to surprise Jane Asher, who was still on tour with the Old Vic in North America, to celebrate her upcoming 21st birthday. By the beginning of March, Jeff Emmerich and the other members of EMI's staff were starting to feel the pressure. By the end of the album, it wasn't unusual for sessions to start at midnight and finish at dawn, which put a strain on all of us, the engineer recalled. We sometimes suspected that Mal Evans was putting something in our tea to keep us awake, but we never found out for sure. I doubt very much if he ever dosed us with acid. It wouldn't have been very helpful to the Beatles if we were tripping in the control room, but I suppose it's possible that he might have occasionally spiked the tea with a mild upper. Meanwhile, as the Beatles were putting the finishing touches on the new LP, Mal and Neil were consumed with a project of immense complexity. Working with pop artist Peter Blake and Jan Haworth, Blake's creative collaborator and wife, the band had envisioned an ambitious cover design, and Mal and Neil were tasked with bringing together the various elements: costumery, photographs, props, even landscaping of all things, for the tableau being constructed in the studio. Haworth vividly recalled Mal's good-natured attitude during their lengthy sessions to stage the cover art. He was a very sweet person in a world of poseurs, she said. Where everyone else seemed fractious and self-serving, Mal was laid back and genuine. And in the midst of everything, Mal and Neil took on the guise of moving men, transporting household items for Ringo and Maureen down from Liverpool to Sunny Heights. Up in Liverpool, Gary joined his father as he loaded up the trailer with furniture. They were joined by Neil, who was driven over to Mosley Hill by his girlfriend, Mona Best, and their 5-year-old son, Rogue, who played in the yard with Gary. Before he made the return trip to London, Mal gazed at Gary in wonder, contemplating his good fortune. Love him, he wrote in his diary. Think I'd give my life for him. Hope I would. At the same time, Mal made a point of speculating about his motives for keeping a diary in the first place. Do I write this for other people to read, he wondered? Was the act of journaling about his emotions and experiences a performance for somebody else's benefit? Was the roadie maintaining his diaries for posterity?
That, of course, is our guest today, Smithsonian Associate Beatles historian and author of the new book, Living the Beatles Legend, The Untold Story of Mal Evans, Ken Womack. Ken's graciously agreed to read this passage from his wonderful book, and we've got him today, so please join me in welcoming back to the Not Old Better Show, Smithsonian Associates Interview Series on radio and podcast, Smithsonian Associate Ken Womack. Ken Womack, welcome back to the program.
So glad to be here.
I'll tell you, it's so good to talk to you. I love all things Beatles. We've been, of course, so fortunate to have heard your reading. That's wonderful. And we're going to talk about your new book, Living the Beatles Legend, The Untold Story of Mal Evans. The book is fantastic. I just can't recommend it enough. I know our audience is going to be excited to get into this with you. You're going to be appearing at Smithsonian Associates coming up. So why don't we talk first about that, then we'll jump into the book. We'll talk about Mal Evans and really get into this, Ken Womack, because this is just going to be fascinating. I'm really, really excited to talk to you again. I just always love talking about the Beatles with you, and you're going to be talking about the Beatles at your Smithsonian Associates presentation. Why don't you tell us briefly about what you're going to be talking about there and how you'll use Zoom to engage us? We're all on Zoom these days.
You bet. So I'll be speaking about Mal Evans, who was the Beatles roadie before Beatlemania hit England in October 1963. Mal was there as a full-time roadie along with Neil Aspinall. And I'll be talking about his life, the journals that he kept, the photographs that he took, etc., all of which might have been lost to the world, but thanks to an enterprising temporary worker in 1988 who found them 12 years after Mal died, we're able to enjoy and learn from his materials. And as always, when I do my talk for our good friends at the Smithsonian, I will have all sorts of visual imagery ready for you. Mal was a wonderful sketch artist. We have great music that we'll listen to along the way. We'll see his actual diaries and photographs of the Beatles. And it will all come to life splendidly with a series of GIFs.
Yeah, it will come to life. Again, the book is fantastic, the title of which is Living the Beatles Legend, The Untold Story of Mal Evans by Ken Womack, our guest today. You know, you so generously read that passage, and one of the images that just jumped out at me, which I thought was fantastic. All the images in the book are fantastic, but one that jumped out to me was, and you kind of make reference to this section at the end of your reading, is this memorialization of Mal's life, this journaling, this diary. John Lennon at one point wrote Mal a note signed by John saying, "Good luck with the book. Heaven help us all." I just thought, there's something there that we got to know about. What was the most shocking revelation that you found in some of this unpublished work, the archives that you mentioned?
Well, you know, the shocking revelations, and I think this is what John Lennon meant, were about Mal. Mm-hmm. And, you know, his emotional life, his imaginative life. You know, for the outside world, who got to know Mal pretty well through photographs, even during the age of the Beatles themselves, you know, he seemed like a lovable, perhaps even oafish character, and he just isn't. You know, he's thoughtful, you know, wide-thinking, well-read, This is his version of life inside this Beatles whirlwind, which I think was a lot more harrowing than people ever recognized. Harrowing rather. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, than people recognized. By 1965, they're seeing lots of violence on the concert trail. It was rough going.
Yeah, I thought it was, again, kind of referring back to the reading you selected. The artist Jan Hayworth, I think it's her name that's referred to there. She said that Mal's not a poser. He was a very deep person, not an oaf by any means, but he was a big man. I mean, physically a big man, and he left this very stable job to dive headlong into this world of rock and roll, which there was some violence. What was it that motivated Mal, and especially what really drove this deep relationship, this connection that he had with the Beatles?
He was like a number of folks that we see enter their orbit around this time and even earlier. Stu Sutcliffe, his family, the ill-fated bassist for the Beatles, who died in 1962. His family couldn't believe that since he was so talented at art, he was spending his time with these guys. And he said, I just want to find out what's going to happen. And I think Mal was of that ilk too. He recognized that something really special was taking place, and he wanted to see what would happen. And was willing to take certain risks. They were definitely risks, though. The Beatles are so commonplace now. It's hard to even remember that this was not always so, that, there was a moment when they could have been the thing they feared the most, a flash in the pan, right? Mm-hmm. That they might not have stood the test of time, much less the test of 1963. Mm-hmm. So Mal gives us a deep window into that. This was a great risk that he took. Working with Jan Hayworth, you mentioned her before, she could tell that he was the real thing. Mm-hmm. Mal, knowing, the nature of this enterprise, threw himself headlong into the process. When it came to sketching out possible logos for Apple Records, he was all in. Whatever they wanted him to do, Mal was going to do. He came up with his own Sgt. Pepper logo. He had no issues when they didn't use it, but he just wanted to be a part of things and to roll up his sleeves and be of assistance.
Yeah, and he was this amazing assistant, and we all focused on the Fab Four. And that was just, what drove everything. But here is this man, this important man behind the scenes, this unsung contributor who, as you say, did this artwork. He participated. He is kind of known as a roadie, but he was just so much more than that. He even had some influence on some of the Beatles' music. And I wonder if you'd talk for just a second about what that was all about. Some of the instances that, where he was driving some of the lyrics and some of the songs and some of the creative influence there.
Sure. So McCartney especially had no issue whatsoever asking Mal for his opinion, to add a lyric here and there. And they did this sort of thing, in the studio. They had a really small entourage overall. The Beatles didn't have a huge team of people that they ran around with. It just wasn't like that. They had the folks back home from Liverpool, George Martin, Brian Epstein, and that really was it when it came to the studio. And so Mal and Neil were part of everything, and they were trusted, So on occasion, if they wanted Mal to take up a percussive instrument or play a note on a keyboard, there he was, and they trusted him to do it. And there's a wonderful scene in the Get Back docuseries where you can see Paul sort of running the lyrics of A Long and Winding Road by Mal. Mm-hmm. Actually offers a pretty good change in terms of a middle section there in the song. So, these were really trusted folks right at the heart of this storm that they were all living inside of for 6-7 years.
He was also known as a guardian angel of sorts for his boys. He kind of referred to him. What were some of the instances where, he had to make some difficult decisions or maybe make some sacrifices on behalf of the Beatles?
Well, I mean, when we talk about sacrifices, and this is an important aspect of this story, Mal sacrifices a lot of time with his family, probably more than he needed to, even by the Beatles' estimation. So, his devotion to them is paramount to understanding his makeup. He's arguably too devoted to them. There's a lovely quote, we even reprinted it on the back of the book, that Mal said, I couldn't get enough of them. They were better than food and drink, which is, for Mal, he loved food and drink. He's a big guy who had big appetites. That's saying something. So he does make lots of sacrifices. There are moments when he puts himself in the fray. In Manila, famously, in 1966, he barely escapes with his life after the Marcoses set upon the Beatles and basically drummed them out of the country. There's a moment, probably the only time he got in a real fight was on behalf of George Harrison at Paris's Olympia Theater in 1964, which Mal thought was kind of funny because, they think that he's this big, this big guy who's going to kind of impress you with his fierceness, when in fact he was a teddy bear. He didn't want to hit anybody or be hit. He would secretly say, "I'm a giant coward." I don't want that. But, he seemed menacing to some, and he would use his size when they would have people who would try to corner them in London, for example. Mal would, very gently and very carefully edge them out of the way by using his hulking figure to do so. He felt like, though, that when he was doing that, he would need to do it in the nicest way possible, because when he did, he was representing the Beatles. So he didn't want a headline that said, fan roughed up by Beatles roadie. He wanted them to have a good conversation. He was a great person with a gift of gab. And when they were sent on their way, feel good about it.
Ken Womack, returning guest, is with us today. Ken Womack has written the new book, Living the Beatles Legend, The Untold Story of Mal Evans. Ken Womack will be appearing at Smithsonian Associates. We will be providing links in the show notes today for our audience so that they can find more information about the upcoming Smithsonian Associates presentation, the new book, Living the Beatles Legend, Ken Womack's work on kennethwomack.com, Everything Fab 4. Ken Womack lectures about the Beatles, is a Beatles expert, and this book just really brings all of this together. Ken Womack, let's talk for a minute or two about the post-Beatles journey that Mal was on, because he continued on after the Beatles broke up into their solo careers. What were some of those challenges that he faced, and maybe even some of the opportunities that came his way during that phase of his life and then the life of the Beatles?
It's interesting you bring that up, because there is this feeling among Beatles folk that, Mal was just left to go adrift, right? And it's just not the case. He worked with them really for the rest of his life, and was very active in the solo careers of John Lennon, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr. Paul, of course, was on the other side of the rift involving the dissolving of their partnership. Or Mal certainly would have done anything and everything Paul wanted to, and even does have a few collaborations here and there. But it was a period where Mal was going to live out some of his ambitions, and I think some of these contribute to the sad eventuality of his life. And one of them is working with Badfinger. He essentially discovered the band, really loved them. The Welsh, the Welsh combo that had so many Beatlesque qualities to them. Great songwriters, great singers, twin guitarists. They're just a wonderful band. And Mal was dead set on helping them. And it was Alan Klein who stepped in and refused to let Mal work with them any further. And it really broke Mal, which is what Klein meant to do. I mean, it's kind of a cruel act. He has other successes. Mal will produce a top 5 hit by Badfinger, No Matter What, one of their best known songs. Mm-hmm. He will also compose a song with George Harrison that's on the Ringo LP called "You and Me, Babe," closes the album. Mal made a nice penny out of that with the residuals from that, top 5 record. So he was living out a lot of his ambitions, but there were just so many more to go after his untimely death.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about that for a minute, because that was controversial. Certainly there was some mystery around it. You really did a lot of work into that, because there were a lot of rumors and myths about some of that. Maybe tell us a little bit about his controversial end, and what a tragic end it was. What light were you able to shed on some of those circumstances?
Well, the whole business had really been shrouded in, as you said, rumor and myth. And a lot of it is wishful thinking. I find there are several stories about the Beatles where wishful thinking's involved. We want it to be a certain way, right? There's a lot of that going on right now with the, with the hit song that's out on the airwaves.
Yeah, it's great timing.
It's just fascinating to me. And the wishful thinking around Mal goes something like this, that he was killed in a terrible mistake by the LA police on January 4th, 1976, and that it was, a big error, a domestic standoff, somebody should have helped Mal, etc. When in truth, and you're right, I spent a lot of time on this because I knew it was going to be one of the key issues alive at the heart of this story. And frankly, even with all the work that I've done in amassing the evidence from so many different sources, there are probably still going to be some folks who don't buy it. And, that's okay. They need to ask their own questions about that. But Mal committed suicide by cop. There's just no way around it. He was doing all the things, sadly, that folks who are going to commit suicide do. He was preparing people, even though they couldn't tell at the time, for life after Mal. He would say things like, "Let me show you how to winterize the home." What? He was, also, he wrote a will, in a kind of a hurried state the night before everything occurred. When he brandished the working rifle that he had, this is another one of the rumors that this is a air rifle. It was actually a gift from his girlfriend in May 1974 when he turned, I guess it would have been 39. She had given him a working Winchester rifle, which, makes perfect sense for Mal, who was very much into guns. He was fascinated by the Old West. And even had remarked at one point in 1975 that, when he goes, he wants it to be a hail of bullets. And he engineered exactly that. The police took their time going upstairs in their home, giving him lots of chances to give up, finally gently pushing open the door where there's Mal with the gun, and he raises it, and cops did what cops do.
Tragic. And yet we have so much of Mal to this day, the diaries, the manuscripts, the memorabilia that you referred to. The research is, as usual, Ken Womack, because you and I have talked previously about your work, is just so impressive and wonderful. Congratulations on all of this work. It just is fantastic. I have so enjoyed it. I know our audience will. And again, I can't recommend it enough. Living the Beatles Legend, the Untold Story of Mal Evans. Let's talk about some of those artifacts and the lost treasures, really, if you will. How did those redefine the Beatles story?
Well, what they do is they give nuance to it, right? Mm-hmm. There's a day-by-day calendar. We've had some great Beatles scholars out there reconstructing these moments for a long time. Mark Lewison comes immediately to mind. And here's Mal, providing contemporaneous evidence that generally supports those findings. Occasionally, he'll show up with some new surprises, but, it's just incredibly valuable primary documentary evidence, right? One of the first things I did when Gary Evans sent the materials here to me on the Jersey Shore is I opened up the diary and looked at May 9th, 1969. Paul McCartney told Mr. Lewison, I think back in 1991, that was the day they broke the Beatles. They broke the Liberty Bell of the Beatles. They couldn't put it back together after that. And so I wanted to see, what did Mal experience that day watching his idols, right, descend into chaos and have a war of words from which they couldn't come back, and flipped right to the page. And I was so proud. I got to tell Mr. Lewison about it. I said, "You're not going to believe," and he agreed. When you go to that page, there it is. All it is a drawing. It was a moment when words would not suffice for what Mal, who was experiencing it and probably suffering deeply, there's an image of Paul McCartney losing his ever-loving mind as the others are asking him to sign on with this person who, Paul was right, proved to be their undoing.
Again, I love the book, and you generously sent me a copy of it. I've got it here in my hands, and I always enjoy the photos. And you made reference to the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club image that Mal provided, that the Beatles didn't select, but nonetheless, it gave Mal this sense of inclusion and contribution. And so many of the other photos are just they're unseen, for one thing, which is fantastic. I wonder if do you have a favorite photo among them? Maybe just tell us about one.
Wow, it changes, but
yeah.
It does. There is one in particular that I think about a lot, and that is Mal was in the movie Blind Man as an extra, which is one of Ringo's movies in the 1970s. And there is a shot of them learning to ride horseback. And it just, every time I look at it, I think, what is this I'm seeing? It kind of boggles my mind, because they look like fish out of water. You don't think Mal Evans and Ringo riding horses, but there they are. In I believe it's Spain, there they are riding horseback, and Mal's shirtless. They just look, it's just the strangest, most wonderful thing. These two on horseback on that film set in, I guess, 1971. It just, it never fails to bring a smile to my face. I love Mal's wedding pictures because they were taken so beautifully by the photographer back in 1957. I go back to those. My agent loves the one that Mal took of Paul when they're in Colorado during that visit in the reading where they go to see Jane Asher, and they're on a break, and there's Paul shirtless lying on the rental car, with his Sgt. Pepper era mustache, and it's just wonderful, and what Mal does for us, I think, and what I really tried to capture in this book, is it humanizes this big story. Right. It's still one of the biggest stories going. And there's Mal, bringing this very, very human element to it, which is, was the magic of him. And I think if we polled the Beatles, they would agree that was the best part, was Mal's humanity.
So nicely put. Again, the title of the book is Living the Beatles Legend, The Untold Story of Mal Evans. Our guest today has been Ken Womack. The book is fantastic. Again, audience, check this out. It is wonderful. It's not just me saying that. Jordan Runtaw of People Magazine says, a holy grail for fans, offering an extended look into the band. And Publishers Weekly says, Womack's account is full of thrilling moments. Devoted fans of the band will find much to cheer about. Ken Womack, I know you're super busy. I so appreciate your time. I want to ask you just one kind of final question about, what can we learn from Mal's story, and what are some of perhaps the lessons for today? For aging musicians, we musicians play. The Stones just released their a recent album, and certainly these older acts are touring an awful lot. What do you think that they're going to learn from Mal Evans in his life and his career?
Well, interestingly, folks like the Stones or the Who would have known Mal and probably quite well. The takeaway for me, it kind of hit home with me. I met with Pete Best here in New York City a couple months ago, and he was in town, and I said, so what about Mal? And he said, first and foremost, Mal was a fan. And I think that maybe the larger tale about Mal involves the idea of fandom and what it means to be really close to the objects of your passion. And, Mal adored them, loved them, but his fandom does run amok, I mean, there's a moment, almost sad moment during the Revolver sessions where the Beatles have to say, Mal, you need to go back up to Liverpool. Your daughter was just born. So there's an interesting kind of cautionary tale in there somewhere that I haven't fully interpreted. I want the reader to do that. I think we all have to interpret our own different levels of passion or commitment or overzealousness about the objects that we adore.
Yeah. Hard not to adore Mal Evans. Again, Ken Womack's been our guest. Thanks, Ken. It is so great to talk to you. I know you're working on something. We'd love to have you back when you complete that next project. And if it's about the Beatles, boy, I'll just jump at the chance. But always good to talk to you. Hope you're well. Hope your family's all well and everybody's good. And do have a good rest of your day. And I look forward to seeing you at Smithsonian Associates coming up. But thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thank you.
So for those of you who are 60 and above, who might have lived through Beatlemania, I know that you've just loved this interview, and you'll love the upcoming Smithsonian Associates presentation by Ken Womack. Does it make you reflect back on the icons of your past and those unsung heroes who enabled them? How could they not? So, what a treat to speak with author, Smithsonian Associate Ken Womack about his upcoming presentation titled Living the Beatles Legend, the Untold Story of Mal Evans, and his new book of the same name. Please check out our show notes today for more details about Ken Womack's upcoming presentation at Smithsonian Associates. My thanks to the Smithsonian team for all they do to support the show. My thanks to you, my wonderful audience here on radio and podcast. Please be well, be safe, and let's talk about better. The Not Old Better Show, Smithsonian Associates Interview Series on radio and podcast. Thanks, everybody, and we will see you next week.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Not Old Better Show, Smithsonian Associates Interview Series on radio and podcast. Join us again next time as we deep dive into some of the most fascinating real-life stories from across the world, all focused on this wonderful experience of getting better, not just older. Let's talk about better. The Not Old Better Show, Smithsonian Associates Interview Series on Community Radio.